Start with the big global news. Turkey has launched a military operation against Kurdish fighters in northeastern Syria. Warplanes have bombed militia positions in towns near the border, killing 2 civilians thus far.
Thousands carrying their belongings have fled the town of Ras Al Ain, held by the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces. The operation comes just days after U.S. troops pulled back from the area. The U.S. troops had been fighting with Kurdish-led forces against the Islamic State. It marks an abrupt policy shift by U.S. President Donald Trump, who has been sharply criticized at home for betraying America's Kurdish allies. Turkey has said it intends to create a safe zone in order to return millions of refugees to Syrian soil.
All right, let's try to understand this now global conflict. Turkey has launched that operation. We're joined by Matshidiso Motsoeneng from the Afro-Middle East Centre on the line for us. Matshidiso, thank you. Just give us some background to this conflict right now, because it seems like Turkey has been itching to sort of start moving into northeastern Syria for a while.
Yes, thank you for having me. So Turkey has been for months urging the U.S. to take action against its Kurdish allies, who they've supported financially and militarily in their fight against the Islamic State group since the outbreak of the Syrian war, and especially since the emergence of the Islamic State group in 2014. Turkey sees the Kurdish allied forces, specifically the YPG and its political wing, the PYD, as an extension of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which had been operating as an insurgency in Turkey and classified as a terrorist group by Turkey, the European Union, and America. And they've really been trying to get the U.S. to take some action against them, and the U.S. has so far not done anything. And this has been really their moment where they see their actions as the last resort.
And this is all because, mainly because of U.S. President Donald Trump's decision to pull out U.S. troops. Is it that simple?
Yes. So Donald Trump, as we know, even on his first campaign, has been running on the ticket of trying to pull U.S. troops in what he's called endless wars in the Middle East. So he's been looking for an exit strategy for a long time. The issue against the fight against the Islamic State group has been one of the biggest reasons why he didn't immediately pull out of Syria. And after announcing this pullout earlier this year from Iraq and now Syria and others in Afghanistan, he decided that, you know what, there's no use in stalling anymore. He's up for his re-election soon. So he really needs to get this issue done so he can have something to run his campaign again. So really this decision has then allowed the Turks to essentially say, okay, you're not going to stick to the agreement to disarm the YPG as we officially agreed 2 years ago with you. You're just going to leave us, essentially giving the Turks the green light to go into northeastern Syria and launch this military operation and create what they call a safe zone.
And his critics in the U.S. are saying he's now betrayed the Kurds that worked with the U.S. against ISIS in northern Syria. Is that fair criticism of the U.S. president?
Yes, sure. But it doesn't come as a surprise, at least for many of us. And the Kurds as well, I don't think they're very surprised by it. The U.S. has done this to them before. They did it in many parts in Syria before. Recently, in January 2018, when Turkey launched what they called Operation Olive Branch in just next to northeastern Syria in Afrin province, the U.S. essentially stepped back and allowed the Turks to go in and fight the Kurds, which they were forced to pull back from. So this didn't really come as a surprise that this would ultimately be the U.S. decision. The only thing was how long could they stall it for, and whether or not Turkey would eventually give up on its demands to push the YPG further away from its borders. They looked at getting a 100-kilometer deep zone. It doesn't seem like that's what the U.S. is offering them at this point, and hence they've gotten in to try and implement a 30-kilometer deep zone.
So it doesn't sound that bad. Turkey wants a safe zone. It said it's saying these Kurdish terrorists are at its border, so it wants to put some distance between Turkey and them and ensure that Syrians in Turkey can go home through this safe zone. Is the rationale valid? I mean, how much of a threat are these Kurdish fighters to Turkey right now?
As you know, before the outbreak of the Syrian conflict, the issue has always been there. I mean, Turkey has gone to, areas like Iran and Iraq and really bombed what they call PKK terror cells. In Syria, the issue wasn't so much because for a long time, the PYD maintained that it was not linked to the PKK. And until the outbreak of the Syrian conflict where, we saw the rise of the YPG as a very strong military force, of course, leveraging the proliferation of the arms that then, flooded Syria at the outbreak of the war, but specifically also leveraging the U.S. interference and their support financially. This then raised the issue of security for Turkey, who, despite, not seeing them as that much of a bigger threat compared to the groups that are in Iraq and some parts of Iran, for example, saw this as an immediate issue, an unstable country, very lax borders, no proper, stable government. And they saw this really as a big threat to them. This then meant that, even if it's not the YPG themselves, they could host some of the PKK fighters that could easily go into Turkey. I mean, whether or not these fears are legitimate or not is obviously a political debate. But really, this has been the rationale behind them. Whether or not they're going to be able to repatriate Syrian refugees to go back into those areas is also another issue. Many of the Syrian refugees that they host in don't even come from the area that they want to clear and take back into. So not a lot of people are going to agree to be taken back to areas in which they didn't come from in the first place. And also, it's going to upset the demographics in that region because, it's a mainly Kurdish majority area.
And we've just put on screen nearly 600,000 people already dying in the Syrian conflict. What does this mean for civilians? How many civilians are living along this area now being bombed to create that safe zone?
I mean, if you compound this also with what's happening in the neighboring province of Idlib, you have about 3 million people in this region that could potentially be affected by this. I mean, you already said in your introduction, people are already starting to flee. You already have people living on trees alongside the border with Turkey in Idlib and other parts of Afrin, because Turkey won't open its borders for more Syrian refugees to come. They already have over 2 million of them in their own country. So really, we're going to see a new wave of a humanitarian crisis, especially if this issue takes longer to resolve. I mean, what we can hope for now is that the Kurdish forces eventually give in, strike some sort of a deal with the Assad regime, and eventually allow Turkey to establish this so-called safe zone, at least for 20 kilometers. But if it continues, really the effect will be very devastating already in the context of very limited humanitarian resources that are even able to reach the mostly affected people.
Yeah, such suffering already. So in finality, I mean, the U.S. is allowing this to happen. Well, President Donald Trump is allowing it to happen. He has been criticized by some of his critics in the U.S. But what about the rest of the world? Will they look at this and also say, okay, fair enough, Turkey maybe needs this safe zone, or could there be huge fallout?
I mean, what we've seen in the Syrian conflict is that there's been very little international response and activities that have been able to even, put in a long-term ceasefire agreement. At this point in time, the key players in this conflict have been the Russians, the US, Iran, and Turkey, and to some extent France. The European Union has condemned the Turkish operation. So has been a number of states, but that is not really enough to stop the operation itself. And Turkish President Erdogan has made this very clear that he's going in, he's going to get what he wants, and that's the end of the story. The only people that could potentially stop the Turks at this moment are the Russians. Unfortunately, that's not what they say. Their statement says the Kurds have to come to the table and agree to their terms, and these terms essentially means them abandoning their own military operation and joining the Syrian military and essentially bowing down to the Syrian regime control.
All right, so more fighting in Syria, that Turkish offensive against the Kurds in northeastern Syria beginning today. If it were possible to have more fighting in that area. Thank you very much, Matshidiso Motsoeneng from the Africa-Middle East Centre.